Good morning, everyone. Finally, we're going to start the symposium. Welcome.
We went to Duquesne, though I did tell her she should have gone to Pitt. But nobody is perfect. And so yesterday I had the opportunity to go up to the Duquesne campus, wander around and see parts of your city, a very pretty and a surprisingly hilly city. I think this is the only city where just walking on sidewalks improves your cardiovascular fitness. Right? So no wonder all of you are in amazing shape. So thank you for the invitation to come here once again. So today I'm going to be talking to you about human flourishing. But before I do that, I would like to assure you that I lead a completely pious and blameless life. I was at a hotel recently, and I saw this mural right opposite my hotel. And so there seems to be a zeitgeist of flourishing that seems to be existing. And as pretty as the picture that Dr. Moon just showed you, but I think it also signifies, as you can probably see, this was in Shanghai, you can probably see this idea of flourishing is transnational, spanning both Hawaii and China. And while I'm going to be talking about child well-being, which is a small aspect of flourishing, I think we can intuit that children can only achieve well-being, children can only flourish when their families flourish. And this family flourishing is the science that Dr. Moon and her colleagues are furthering. And families, again, can only flourish when communities are strong. And communities can only flourish when their broader societies are hale and healthy. And so in a sense, when we talk about well-being, which I'm going to talk about in the context of children alone as child well-being, this is inherently an ecological construct. It's inherently a social ecological thing, and that each of these different levels have interdependencies. And so whether we talk about it as flourishing or whether we talk about it as child well-being, I'd like you to keep this idea in mind that we really are talking about a social ecology within which all of us can grow and thrive. This talk is focused around 4 themes. In the first theme, I'll talk about one of the major challenges that we face in the area of child well-being, which is really a conceptual challenge, which is really very close to the first question that Dr. Moon posed. What are we talking about when we talk about child well-being? The second part, I'm going to try and attempt an answer to that question. What is child well-being, based on some of the work that we've been doing? In the third part of my talk, I'd like to address how can we actually achieve child well-being? What are some strategies that we can use to get there? And I realize many of you are from community agencies. And so this part of this talk is really focused towards what you in your centers, in your agencies, in your institutions, if you are administrators or policymakers, can support in order to further a child well-being, family flourishing agenda within your own particular work context. I'll end with a series of next steps in terms of how can we concretely further these social vaccines and penetrate them into the community. And right at the end, a little coda, I'll talk about why now. Why should we think about child well-being now, at this particular time in our nation's history? One major problem seems to be that child well-being, and this is true to some extent also family flourishing, words like thriving, these seem to be largely in the eye of the beholder. So if you are an education person, right, you probably tend to think of child well-being as school readiness, academic preparedness. If you are a mental health person, you may think child well-being is really child mental health reduction. If you are a pediatrician, you probably want your child to be within that growth chart. So child well-being really seems to be in the eye of the beholder. And this seems to be analogous to this problem. This is the so-called parable of the blind men of Hindustan. This is actually an old Sufi mystical teaching, where you have these 4 visually impaired individuals that are trying to describe an elephant. And so the person that looks at the trunk of the elephant says, well, the elephant is like a snake. And the fellow who looks at the elephant's leg says, no, the elephant is actually like a pillar. And these so-called 4 blind men of Hindustan then engage in this really, tumultuous battle against one another, come to fisticuffs. And when you think about this, they're not incorrect, right? Because parts of an elephant are like a snake, part of an elephant is like a pillar. But they're obviously not correct because the elephant is not like a pillar, right? It's not really like a snake. And so it seems to me that when we think about things like school readiness, normal development, mental health, these are not really child well-being. These are expressions or manifestations or characteristics of child well-being. These are ways in which we apprehend, we perceive, we measure, and we conceptualize aspects of child well-being. But child well-being is the elephant, which is much more than any of these three things. So which may lead you to ask me the question, well, what on earth is the elephant? I'm so glad you asked me that question. This is our attempt to define the elephant. In 2015, Anna Alexandrova, who is right now a philosopher at King's College, Cambridge, and I developed what we refer to as the two sources theory of child well-being. So a child displays well-being to the extent that she, A, develops stage-appropriate capacities that equip her for a successful future given her environment, and B, engages with the world in child-appropriate ways. And this is called the two sources theory because the first and the second source both have to be met in order for a child to display well-being. So let's take a slightly deeper dive. Stage-appropriate capacities. Child well-being, we think, is fundamentally a capacity. It is a competency. It is a developmental acquisition of certain skills. These skills are stage-appropriate, not age-appropriate. And this is primarily because we may have a child with intellectual disability who may never achieve an age-appropriate level of development. But that does not mean that the child with the disability is automatically deficient in well-being. It just means that that kid may get there at some other time point, and that's actually fine. Stage-appropriate capacity. The important thing is the acquisition of that capacity. And these are some examples of stage-appropriate capacities. The ability to move, to touch, heck, the ability to suckle, right, which is the first developmental capacity that we have to acquire for us to be compatible with life. Security, the ability to form attachment, the ability to emotionally self-regulate, the ability to attend, to learn, to concentrate, right? These are examples of these capacities, these competencies that children have to master. Second, successful future. Not all capacities, not all competencies are necessarily good. For example, you may have a child who is simply amazing at pickpocketing. We don't think that that is necessarily something that guarantees the child a successful future and should be a capacity that we should encourage the acquisition of, right? So only those capacities that guarantee a child a successful future are things that we think of from a child well-being perspective. What are they? These could be things like health, certainly, emotional maturity, social competence, communication, general, like the ability to sort of work and be and live in society. These are examples of the sorts of things that our successful future constructs capture. And this is basically the idea that childhood, although we invented childhood only in the early 1900s as an independent sociological construct, the idea is that children are really on a journey towards adulthood, right? It's a way stage. And so as we think about the future unfolding of personhood that happens within a child, we have to keep that future in mind as we think about children, right? They are growing and evolving beings. Third, environment. Environment acts as a constraint when it comes to child well-being. So I do some work in Afghanistan. And where things are very difficult for small children, especially for small girls. But even in Afghanistan, you actually see smiling kids that are running around. They have very little. They would live in they would live in conditions that we would consider horrendously substandard. You would think they have absolutely no right to be happy, but guess what they are? And they're running around like putting these, rolling these little like tire rims along the roads, and they're like deliriously happy. They're playing, they invent their own games. Now, their well-being looks very different from the well-being of a child perhaps in an upper class region in Pittsburgh. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the child in Afghanistan is deficient in well-being simply because the child lives in Afghanistan and does not live in Pittsburgh. It also does not mean that the child in Pittsburgh is automatically possessed of greater well-being than the child in Afghanistan. It acts as a constraint. It looks different. It acts as a boundary. There may be, yes, certain things that the child in Afghanistan cannot do compared to the child in Pittsburgh, but there may be things that a child in Pittsburgh can't do compared to a child in Afghanistan. So environment acts as a constraint. It limits the possibility of what constitutes well-being, but within that limit, well-being is achievable. Engaging with the world in child-appropriate ways. Children have to be children. They are not miniature adults, and they should not be forced to be miniature adults. So children need to engage with curiosity, exploration, spontaneity, security. This is what makes childhood childhood. And so this is the last and fourth element of well-being. So if you're with me, you're hopefully convinced that well-being is something that is a little nebulous and could use some restructuring. And you hopefully have managed to persuade you that there is a way of thinking about well-being. You may then ask, so how do we achieve well-being? What should we do in order that kids thrive, that kids flourish? Well, part of these ideas come from our book that Dr. Moon referenced. And in our book, we refer to something that we call social vaccines. Social vaccines address the economic, social, economic, structural, and developmental determinants of mental health. They don't actually target the mental health. They actually target the determinants of mental health. They target what it is that underlies mental health. And so they inherently privilege enhancing both assets and reducing deficits. It's not just about trying to reduce the amount of depression symptomatology in the child. It's also about trying to enhance what is good about the child. It's not just about what's wrong with kids and with families and societies. It's about what's right with kids, families, and societies, and strengthening what is right while we absolutely try and focus on reducing what is problematic. So we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. All of these child well-being strategies are both individual and eco-social, because you'll recall that diagram that I presented where I talked about children within families, within societies, within communities. We have interdependencies being social animals, and so we can't just focus on what happens between a child's ears as the sole target of our interventions. We have to have a much broader perspective that kids actually live in a context, and we have to think about that context within which children live. And for this reason, they are both population as well as person-centered or person-oriented. It's not just about the individual, it's about the populations within which they live. And these are upstream. Some of these strategies are even preconception, in addition to being downstream, in addition to being curative. And these are really developmental and stage specific for the reason that I talked about, that children are on their trajectory towards adulthood. These are some examples that we talk about in our book. There are several others. So social emotional learning programs in schools, for example. Some of you may be doing nurse home visitation programs within your agencies. Perhaps you're doing some parent training, parent strengthening, parent competence enhancing strategies. Maybe some of you are running or are working in child sheltering organizations. Maybe you do home visiting, communities that care. So all of these types of programs are all examples of social vaccines that target the determinants of what makes a child a thriving, flourishing little person. So if you're with me so far, and if you commit to this idea that yes, in order to enhance child well-being, we need to focus not just on the child, but on the child's social ecology through these deployment of social vaccines, how might we potentially do this? So what are the next steps that we might do, whether we are academics, whether we are community professionals, whether we are direct service providers? What might we do? And I'm going to suggest to you about 5 things that we might potentially do. First is to measure it. There are various options that exist for the measurement of well-being, various options exist for flourishing. But the first thing we have to do is really measure it, because unless we measure it, we don't really have a sense of what it is that we're attempting to intervene and change. And so for the past over a year or so, we have a research group. I see Shishi Kang in the audience. I see Amanda Cruz here. Professor Dr. Moon is here. So many of us have been, oh, and Riji is also part of this group. So we've been trying to figure out how do we further a child well-being measurement agenda. And this is one of our papers that we have sent out. I was having a conversation with Pitt Wellness, a person from the Student Wellness Office in earlier about how can we enhance measurement for student wellness here at Pitt. And there are several ways in which we can do this. So we can certainly measure child well-being, adolescent well-being, from a unitary or a global construct, and there are various ways in which this can be done. We can certainly conceptualize and measure various aspects of quality of life for children. We can measure life satisfaction, and this is one thing that we particularly like because we really like to measure life satisfaction as a stand-in for child well-being, and we have a very small 6-item Likert measure that takes 30 seconds to administer that gives us a sense of what's going on with this child. And when I work with community organizations and governments, I oftentimes say that our approach to measuring child well-being is like you first take the temperature of the child. If there's a temperature, then you do blood test, you do a urine test, you do a chest x-ray, you do all that other stuff. But if you don't have a temperature, there's no reason to do all of that other stuff. And so for us, doing a small, simple, cheap 30-second assessment is taking the thermometer and placing it into the child's mouth. So that's our general approach to this. And if you have other questions about specific measurements, Shishi is right here, and she'll be able to answer questions for you. Second, identifying and assessing core components. And if you are in a community organization and you balk at the expense, the size and the complexity of a manualized intervention, you are not alone. As someone who has worked in community organizations and has been the victim of people coming in telling me this is exactly how you ought to do it, and having followed that, I can tell you that a lot of those are based on a set of core components. And if we can figure out a way to capture, adapt, and deploy those core components, you actually don't need all of the other parts of that whole Cadillac. So for example, Nurse-Family Partnership, which we've done some work with, has certain elements like educating the mother, some nutrition, safety in the home, role modeling, some interactions with the child. So these kinds of things are core components, which I think we have to make sure that whatever intervention we use, we deploy appropriately. We also need to obviously focus on core skills among providers. Third, technical support. You may be in organizations where you have to deploy a manualized intervention. And thankfully, you're not alone. Right? You have oodles of support that helps you do this. There are purveyor organizations that can help you do this. So for PATHS, there is something called PATHS Worldwide. If you want to deploy a CTC intervention, Communities That Care intervention, I was touring yesterday, and the University of Pittsburgh has these community centers, which seem like fantastic venues within which these sorts of community-focused interventions can be deployed to strengthen communities, right? So if you want to take the CTC model, Communities That Care model, and use those centers to deploy them, there are organizations, the Center for Communities That Care, that can actually help figure this out. And plus, there are also, while many of these purveyor organizations are built by the people that have developed these interventions, there are other broader technical support systems like the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network, and there were several other organizations that SAMHSA used to deploy, and we don't know if many of them will survive, continue to survive or not. Fourth, encourage local adaptation. Everything is adapted, and we have to move away from this mindset that when an intervention developer comes and talks to a community provider, the intervention developer will say, hey, listen, if I adapt it, that's called adaptation, but if you adapt it, it's called loss of fidelity, I mean, that message we have to get away from. Everything is adapted to some extent or another, right? There is nothing that is not adapted. Individuals are unique, sui generis, communities are unique. So we have to make sure that we don't adapt away those core components. Right? So we have to engage in surface structure adaptations. You may have to change language. We translate, so I'm just, to continue on my Afghanistan example, we translate our stuff into, Pashto and Dari, because there's just no way we can deliver an intervention in English in those communities. We have to change some questions. So for example, questions that are somewhat religiously oriented are very dangerous to ask for these kids in Afghanistan under the emirate, under the Taliban administration. So we have to change those questions. So we have to be careful about some of those questions, changing programming materials, changing videos. We cannot have uncovered women in some of our training videos. So we have to be culturally sensitive to where we are deploying those interventions, because we are not here to be culture warriors, right? We're here to help the kids heal. And so we're happy, that's the goal. And so we're happy to make those adaptations, because it's ultimately about the kids, not about our personal values. And deep structure adaptations in some cases may also need to be made. The point is to be thoughtful about this, and the point is to ensure that we have adequate support to do this. And finally, having some sort of a dashboard in mind, having some sort of a sense of trying to get a feel for, are things going well, are things not going well? So do we have some data-driven, easily understandable, graphical things that your university partners can help develop, so that you as operations people can monitor what's going on in your communities, in your organization on a real-time basis. And obviously, as close to real-time is ideal. Right? We don't want dashboards that are based on data that is 6 months old, because you may need to inform program planning for next week. And so something that's more empirical would be good. I'd like to end this talk by talking about, why should we focus on child well-being now? I think many of us might agree that we are in a somewhat difficult time. Yeah? So why should we focus on well-being, flourishing now? I mean, aren't there bigger concerns? Aren't there greater treatment concerns? And the way that I think about this is that, we don't really think about child well-being, as I said earlier, when the sun is shining, there's a soft breeze blowing, and children are chasing butterflies in the garden. So we worry about child well-being when there's thunder in the air and the skies darken. And that's the time when children actually need that reassurance. They really need that comfort. And this is the time for us to focus on well-being when things are not going well. But there is actually another reason for this, which I'd like to share with you. That by focusing on treatment alone, we are not going to do service to the needs of the child. And that's what I'm going to try and persuade you in the next 3 or 4 slides. Because we've been here before. We have seen this crisis emerge. And this crisis has not necessarily emerged since January. I mean, these kinds of crises have been persisting for years, right? So this idea that this is something new is, I'm sorry, but it's actually a bit of a myth. These things have been there existing. They have perhaps been exacerbated for a variety of reasons, but these are not new. And we have done a whole host of things, right? We have developed new interventions. Sean and I serve on study sections where every single study section, they have a whole host of intervention development that happens. And so we've been developing at great public expense interventions for decades. We've improved access to those treatments. And I was very proud and privileged to serve and work on Obamacare when I worked in Washington. We've developed better care coordination. We've expanded dramatically in the past decade the science of implementation, so that we can actually ensure that effective interventions are delivered and deployed within community settings. We've done a whole host of things, but yet we haven't necessarily been able to move the needle. Why? In order to answer that question, I'm going to share with you a slide from my favorite paper. Unfortunately, I did not write this paper. This was written by Jeff Rose, the late great epidemiologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And just to make this easier to see, so the yellow line represents the blood pressure of London civil servants, and the dotted blue line represents the blood pressure nomads, of tribals of the Masai Mara, so Kenyan highland nomads. And this is systolic blood pressure, which should be around 120, right, the upper number on our blood pressure measure. And so as you can see, the tribesmen of the Masai Mara have a near perfect distribution of their systolic blood pressures, but these London civil servants are quite hypertensive. They have high blood pressures because it's a very difficult job, right? They have political masters that are perhaps fickle, and they're drinking these 3 martini lunches, and it's a tough gig. So they have a high distribution of blood pressures. Now, what we do in treatment is that we take the people that are right at that end of that blood pressure distribution. That is, we take these people and we try and pull them in so that the person that has a near 200 blood pressure reading comes down to having a 120, 130 reading, right? In other words, we do something like this. And this is what I'm calling tail pulling, right? We pull the tails of the disease distribution. But that is not going to solve the distribution of blood pressure, because what we have to do from a population perspective, from a flourishing and well-being perspective, is we have to convert all of these British civil servants into tribesmen of the Masai Mara, at least as far as the distribution of blood pressure is concerned. In other words, we have to take all of these folks and we have to make them these folks. We have to shift this entire curve to the left, so that that entire population distribution changes, so that that can achieve population level well-being. We cannot just focus on the tails of a disease distribution. So the key insight really here is that tail pulling is fundamentally about delivering treatments. It's about delivering interventions. It focuses on reducing the burden of mental disorders. And if we exclusively focus on this, we're not going to succeed, and we have not succeeded. Curve shifting, on the other hand, is about delivering these social vaccines. It's about delivering and addressing the determinants of these problems. Like in the tribesmen of the Masai Mara, why are they having fantastic blood pressure? Well, they have amazing levels of physical activity. Their diet is relatively fantastic. They're not drinking alcohol to excess. They're probably not smoking to excess. Yeah? So those are the kinds of things that allows them to have a phenomenal curve. And you can never get there simply by prescribing an antihypertensive. So treatments, interventions have limited utility in assuring well-being and flourishing. It's not that they have no utility. Yeah? They are necessary, but they're not a silver bullet. And so because the determinants of tail pulling are different from the determinants of curve shifting, we cannot really treat our way to child mental health. So a focus on treatment is necessary, it's insufficient. Yeah? We have to focus absolutely on treatment, but we also have to think about how do we shift those entire curves to the left. And these could be as simple as ensuring community safety, right? Many of those genesis of why children do not thrive in well-being have nothing to do with the child. I remember a study in St. Louis that we were doing where we were encouraging moms to have their kids go out and play. And this was in a community called East St. Louis, which has relatively high crime rates, a lot of poverty. And the mom came and told us, I'm not sending my child out to play. And there was a lovely park outside. So I was very curious. I said, why not? She said, well, if I send my child out to play, my child is going to get shot. And so there, the intervention is not getting the child out to play at risk to life and limb. The intervention there is ensuring community safety. Right? So as we think about what treatments actually mean, I think we have to re-envision the whole determinants process and think about what treatments are and what those treatments are that can really work. And that's why using conventional treatments alone cannot get us to child well-being, cannot get us to flourishing. And this is a critically important investment that we have to make collectively, even at very, very difficult times. And I would argue especially at these very, very difficult times. Because I think I'm sure all of you will agree with me that kids really are among the most sensible investments that we can make. My contact information is here. I'd be delighted to hear from you. Please find me on email, LinkedIn, and thank you for your attention.
got time for a couple of questions and answers. My name is Sean Eek. I'm one of the faculty in the School of Social Work and helping with the Flourishing Collaborative. For those of you who want to ask a question, please do. I know my mind is swimming with ideas and details from Dr. Raghavan's talk. The mics are up here, so don't be shy. I have questions to help get us warmed up. All right. Starting to think about, oh, wonderful. Get us started.
Good morning. My name is Maria, and I'm a mental health therapist, and I work primarily with families. And I was raised in a household where my grandparents lived next door, and my grandmother was my first therapist. So she taught me her skill. She would say to one of my neighbors, come into my kitchen, we have to talk. And she would talk with them about their behavior in school and how they could rectify it. And then she'd send them off with a care package because she knew that that child wouldn't get food for the evening because his parents were at the bar. That was very common in my neighborhood when I was a little girl. Parents would go to work in the steel mills and then go to the bar to drink until the end of the evening, and then someone would go and fetch them. So I decided to become a mental health therapist, just like my grandmother, and it's changed socially. So I like this idea of social vaccination because I think that vaccination became a horrible word during the pandemic. So how do we help people to change and see the value in a neighbor looking out for another person? That's what you're asking us to do, is to start with grassroots again and ask people to come into our kitchen and chat with us about, not being able to have housing. Because in Pittsburgh, we have a horrible homeless population because of our economy right now. So how do we uplift people to get on the bandwagon about social vaccinations?
Yeah, Maria, that's such a great question, and there are several things that occur to me, and I think it's you've been extraordinarily privileged to have that sort of a background with a grandmom, and this, I think, embodies the importance of practice-based evidence in addition to evidence-based practice, right? We talk about evidence-based practice so much, but we don't really talk enough about practice-based evidence. There are folks like your grandma, perhaps like you, who are already doing so many things that are highly therapeutic, perhaps instinctively. And I don't think we have sufficiently paid attention to what those therapeutic behaviors and skills are that we can learn from grandmoms. So I think that's a wonderful illustration of the kinds of things that we ought to be doing. So how do we really create buy-in for social vaccines? I'm actually seeing this happen nationwide. So for example, when we were writing our book, we actually went and spoke to a whole host of communities. And we spoke to communities where, for example, they decided that they needed to do their own community strengthening activity. One lumberyard owner in the community decided that he would have an old barn that he would donate. These people got together in that barn, decided that child obesity was a major problem within their community. And they decided that one way to overcome that obesity thing would be to have families sit together at dinner. And so there was a farmer's market that got involved. There was a retailer that got involved. And these people said, we'll provide subsidized food and this was also a food desert, so they were trying to figure out that problem as well. So kids were not just eating highly processed, highly caloric dense food. So these communities got involved. And they began to do some sort of a data collection to sort of see what our child rates are. And over the years, this is in Western Massachusetts, in the West Adams area, and over the years, we've actually seen declines in child obesity within those communities. So there are these sorts of grassroots-based organizations where communities and people come together. Perhaps it's just one person, it's just two people initially having a conversation, and then they come together. The question isn't so much, to my mind, about how do we create demand for these kinds of activities, because every community wants to thrive, right? I don't think there is a single community that says, no, I want kids in my community to be obese, right? There is no such community. Like, every community wants to thrive. The challenge is how is flourishing possible within the constraints of that community? What does it take for a particular group of people to achieve child well-being within their unique environment? And this is not something that can be addressed using a randomized control trial of psychology undergraduates in an academic institution. This is something that requires individual engagement, perhaps in these community centers that Pitt has, perhaps with the and this is the bread and butter of social work, right? I mean, this is why social work is such a critically important discipline, because it penetrates into communities at levels that very few other places have. We are no longer in the heyday of social psychiatry, where you had psychiatrists out in communities. So these are the kinds of skills and competencies that professions like social work have. And I think plus with the acknowledged competence in things like advocacy and organizing, when we put the science along with advocacy and organizing, I'm optimistic that we actually can get communities to thrive, even in the presence of even in a very difficult policy environment. And the last thing I'll say, since you mentioned food insecurity, in 1925, we write about this story in our book. In 1925, the British-ruled administration in southern India felt that a lot of kids were not coming to corporation schools. They were not sort of going to school. And so they began to figure out, why aren't these kids coming to school? And it turned out that these kids weren't coming to school because if they came to school, they wouldn't get fed, and they had food insecurity. And so these kids stayed home. And instead, their parents couldn't feed them, and therefore made them go work in fields and things like that, or do menial jobs. So the government came up with this idea that, why don't we feed these kids at school? And so this started in 1925. It expanded dramatically in the 1940s. And in the 1980s, the Indian Supreme Court created an entitlement to every child in a government or in a government-aided school to receive a hot-cooked meal at school. And so today, over 1 million children are fed in over 100,000 schools every day, every school day in India. It's called the midday meal scheme. And it's the nation's largest, it's the world's largest social vaccination program, which has resulted in massive benefits. It's resulted in academic readiness, it's resulted in cognitive performance, it's resulted in increased school engagement, it's resulted in a great deal of human skilling. So if policymakers buy into this, you can dramatically expand the scale of these interventions. But even without policymakers, even in a hostile policy environment, communities can engage and make change. So sorry, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, Maria, but thank you for asking it.
Excellent question for Dr. Raghavan. Other questions? Excellent question for Ramesh. Other good questions?
So I don't know why I'm trying to do this, even though I'm sitting right here. My name is Sterling Stone. I actually work for one of the community organizations, the Reagan Christian Center. I'm the Youth and Family Services Director, so this is right up my alley. My question is, going back to the first part of the presentation, where you talked about different layers, from individual to family to community to nation, all the way through. Are you aware of an organization or a conglomerate of organizations that have said, this is one issue that we have come up with a curriculum or an intervention at each one of these points for government, from all the way down to the individual, and all of these are kind of working in tandem? And then if so, what is that organization, and where can I get a hold of them?
So, the last part of your question was, what
is it? Who is doing that work right now, and how can I get in touch with them?
I'm not aware of a community or a local organization that spans that entire ecology. Because I think it's really hard to do. And if there is, and if some of you know of any such organizations that have that kind of a bandwidth, please do let me know, because I'm constantly learning all the time. It would seem to me for an organization that's really, really hard to do in many ways. But however, I think it can be done on the other side, I think, through effective policy making. I'll give you an example. So in communist East Germany, the state would provide subsidized childcare. And studies that have been done on the plight of women in communist East Germany showed that these women had greater participation in the labor market, which is why East Germany was so popular. Their kids were much more nutritious. The women had more sex. There were a whole host of these positive outcomes that they showed. And this is because these kids would be dropped off at this daycare center. They'd be taught, they'd be fed, they'd be bathed. And by the time the mom is ready and comes off a shift to work, the kid would be like presented. And so all that the mom had to do and the parents had to do is to put the kid to bed. And she could have the rest of the thing open. And they would also have these little things that the mom could actually take, so she didn't have to cook at home after a hard day's work. And that radically transformed East German society to the extent that when German reunification happened, women in the former East Germany were disgusted with their new circumstances, because they were used to having a much higher quality of personal life, not a higher quality of material life, but a higher quality of personal life than women in the former West Germany. So I think there are many things that we can do. As someone who works globally, as someone who was raised in England, I find it somewhat a little disappointing that in the United States we're not a very child-friendly community. And I think it's so hard for working people who are trying to raise children, especially if you don't have a large number, if you don't have a lot of family resources to make that happen. So I think the way to get there is through public policy. I don't think we can get organizations to go all the way from the grassroots to national level, but I think we can get policymakers to implement national policies that can percolate all the way down to grassroots communities. I somehow feel that that's the way that this can be done. I don't know if that fully answers your question, Sean.
Yes, I guess what I'm looking, is there like a set curriculum, or have someone on a policy level said these are interventions that we would like to see on a community level, and these interventions also match this other organizations, that does, one-on-one mentoring on a level. And then there's also a local government that also has an agency that is next. So you know what I mean? Like they're connected, even though it might not be the same agency, but they're connected, but they all have the same underlying philosophy and underlying kind of values.
Great, fantastic. So I'll give you two suggestions. Both of these are like, academics are not supposed to have favorite interventions. But these are two things that are really dear to my heart, right? One is the Children's Defense Fund under Reverend Starsky Wilson. And I think, they've done such a phenomenal job for black and brown kids. And if you ever go to their, their Harambe, if you ever go to any CDF people here, any CDF folks? Okay. So if you go to one of their harambes and they all sing, something inside so strong, I mean, you can see this is a youth empowerment thing that they're doing. But they're not just stopping there, right? There is education, there is acculturation, there is self-identity and self-worth, there is anti-racist education, there is sort of, anti-oppressive and diversity programming. And these kids are expected to go back into their communities and effectively change their communities. And in many of the communities to which these kids go back, especially when you have kids going back to the same communities over and over again, those communities actually change. They begin to see themselves as agents of change rather than as victims of change. And that mindset that in CDF is cultivated is fantastic. We're actually doing a participating in a CDF evaluation right now in New Jersey, where we're trying to understand what are some of these broader, they may begin at child well-being, but they end in community empowerment and regional empowerment. And CDF, as you may know, has a very, very strong national advocacy organization and advocacy wing as well. The second example I'll give you is communities that care, which which I really love because it's a community-led model where researchers and academics are consultants. They're not necessarily the ones driving the thing, right? It's communities that are driving the thing, because the academic is not the expert on the community, and the community is the expert on the community. But the academic has a lot of your academic partners bring a lot to the table, right? They bring science, and they bring time, and they bring talented graduate students, and they bring a whole host of intellectual resources that can be brought to bear. They can answer questions that you might potentially have, but they're not really there for agenda setting. They can't tell you, you should do this, you should do that, right? That's what the community ought to be doing. And so the CTC model, Communities That Care model, is a fantastic model that basically leverages academic enterprise in the service of community goals, establishes it's sort of a purveyor of interventions that are necessary for community-identified problems, because every community has different needs. So there is no one-size-fits-all. And so it identifies, for community-identified problems, specific interventions. It helps communities deploy and implement those interventions. And it helps communities develop some sort of a tracking mechanism / informal evaluation that can help communities realize whether or not they've moved the needle or not. And CTC is intrinsically linked to public policy making at the local level, because what typically happens is that the county human services folks, or the county health folks, or the county poverty folks, or the county income support folks all become involved, and they basically say, all county nutrition people, they all become involved, and they say, okay, this is working in the community, let's do a county-wide sort of a process. Yeah, so those are two things that I think are really worthy of emulation.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm a former Head Start teacher and now director of the Office of Child Development here at Pitt, so everything you're saying very much resonates with me. I'm curious if you've seen any examples of universities as social vaccines. When I look around the University of Pittsburgh, I don't hear us talking about our work in terms of promoting child well-being as a university overall, but that's what I see. So when I look at all the community engaged research, or you mentioned our community engagement centers, we have folks that are trying to make the water cleaner, that are trying to, even our student wellness program, like you mentioned, we are in a sense training future parents to have better wellness themselves to be able to support children. So I often wonder how you can leverage universities as this social vaccine ecosystem. So I'm curious if you've seen that anywhere or have any thoughts on that.
I think there are what the economists call green shoots, which is their way of saying there are emerging things that are happening. And clearly the initiative that Dr. Moon is leading here, and the Flourishing Research Collaborative is an example of universities taking leadership in the flourishing space. There are typically child development departments where this happens. There are community health departments within schools of public health where this happens. In many universities, we no longer have social and preventive medicine residencies. Like at WashU, we stopped our social and preventive medicine residency, so there is no community medicine anymore. So the School of Medicine has moved away from that. But nursing schools oftentimes have a much more social emphasis. Schools of dentistry have oral and community health programs where they go into communities and try and solve them. The challenge, though, is, and education space, right? There are at NYU, there are people that are doing some amazing thing in the area of education. And I was talking to Taylor Walsh the other day, who runs this whole child education sort of a perspective. and where they are sort of thinking about how do we re-envision education towards well-being rather than just towards mastery of a certain set of tools and tasks that will be on a test. So teaching kids, so why don't we have, why can't we teach botany in the woods, why can't we, if an ADHD kid is having a problem in displaying in-seat behavior, why don't we have classes outdoors, which we know there is empirical evidence for this, that kids that have attentional disorders actually do well in natural settings learning the content, because their problem is not actually with the content, their problem is with the mode in which that content is being delivered, that is having to sit in a class. So I think there are those kinds of things that are happening. Some of those are in universities and some of those are outside universities. And I think we need to fundamentally change the incentive structure within universities, because we prioritize discovery over implementation. We prioritize novelty over impact. I think tend to prioritize the latest, greatest, sexy thing over the thing that's lasting, sustainable, and perhaps is somewhat boring. So I think but there are university leaders that are seeing the need for impact as a metric for academic success. I was at WashU where in our promotion and tenure standards, it was written that you have to have some measure of impact beyond the academy. That's what we wrote, it has to have impact beyond the academy. And so when you incentivize people like that, people will deliver. And so if you look at a lot of these faculty-based things that have come out of WashU, these may not get an NIH grant. They are maybe foundation supported. They're probably not using a horrendously expensive equipment. The university perhaps isn't making as much money on those research projects as it would on a School of Medicine research project. But you know what? I think that's okay. Right? I mean, not everything needs to be looked at from a purely economic lens. It can be looked at from a human lens as well. So I think there are things that are happening, and clearly there could be more.
All right, we've got time for maybe one more question.
Hi, my name is Meghna Dada, and I am a neuroscience student here at Pitt. And I'm a part of a research effort here called the Social Change Research Hub, and we're actually designing a global racial equity consciousness database, and it's being done in collaboration with the UN. So we are really looking at the globalization of it now. And so one specific question that I had in regards to this idea that we've been talking about with like a social vaccine and having a vaccine that can apply very broadly to communities. Your ideas on operationalizing these variables and making them be able to be measured across these different communities was something really interesting to me, because that's what we're trying to figure out in this like intervention mapping process to see if our database will actually be as effective as possible. And so I was wondering what your input would be on how exactly to almost standardize the data points that we're looking for when we're looking at these different backgrounds and different environments that the people that we're looking to get feedback from may be in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. And can I just say, I'm so glad that we have neuroscientists in this audience. I mean, that's exactly the sort of, cross-intellectual pollination that we need. So I'll give you an example. And how much time do I have, Sean? Can I?
5 minutes.
Okay, so I'll give you an example, and I'll try and be brief. I'll give you an example, and then I'll try and draw some strategies to draw some conclusions from there that may answer your question. Otherwise, come find me. So in our previous book, Implementing Public Health Interventions in Developing Countries, we were working in these remote rural villages in southern India. And one of the things that we wanted to do is to increase the prevalence of safe drinking water in these communities. Now, the classic approach would be we have to pipe in like purified water, we have to figure out, water purification systems. I mean, it's a big production, right? That the local government has to get involved and piping has to be done, and it was just horrendous. And then one of our field teams had this idea. They said, well, we have these aquariums where we filter water. So why don't we just engineer that process for communities? And so we were like, what? Well, how does that work? And so it turns out that in aquariums, they actually have a gradation of particulate matter, right? So they filter it through like rocks, and then there's like salt, and then there's even smaller things and even smaller things. And they said all that we need to do is we need to create an aquarium filtration system that will serve a village. Okay, so the demonstration project was really one that would serve a household, and that's what they did. So they found a plastic tank that was used to store water. They collected these locally available materials, which are used everywhere, like their pebbles and sand and things like that. And they created some sort of a mesh at the bottom. They poured all this water on top. And then over time, that thing percolated, and they actually found they collected water, and they sent it to a lab, and it turns out that it's actually pretty good. You just take that water and you boil it for like 5 minutes, and it's ready to drink. And so this was something that could be done by the community, using locally available materials, using locally available know-how, at a cost that was a fraction of what it would have cost them to bring in like piped water into those communities. Now, I'm not actually saying that they should not have piped water or they should not have piped drinking water, right? That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is until you have piped drinking water and access to those things, there are things that communities can do in order to reduce their rates of waterborne diseases, right? So until that happens, there is something they can do in interim. So this, I think, offers a model for the kinds of things we ought to be doing. Number one, we need to have a clear understanding of what the problem is. Number two, we need to have a clear understanding of how do we measure whether we have a problem or not. In this case, water stuff, bad stuff in water. Number three, we need to figure out something that addresses the determinants of what that problem is. So in this case, the fact that the water that they were actually collecting from rivers and ponds was sorely contaminated, and so we needed to move a little upstream. Fourth, we need to figure out what locally available, local know-how, local resources are that would potentially allow us to develop these sorts of solutions. And ideally, those things have to come from members of the community themselves, not necessarily from outside resources. Number five, I think the actual quote-unquote intervention or treatment is something that should be available and can easily be developed and can be brought up to scale by folks that are actually going to be benefiting from it. And number six, you have to test it. So you have to run the water through, see if this makes sense to you. Part of the reason why chlorination programs don't work is when you cook with chlorinated water, it changes the taste of food. And so people were saying, well, I don't want to have chlorinated water because I would rather have regular water and boil it. And that was causing all of these problems. So I think testing this, making sure that that's workable. I think this is a sequence of steps that I think is relatively generalizable, and I think it's empirical. I mean, try it in your community and see if it works, and then we can always go back to the drawing board and modify as necessary. Nothing is set in stone.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Please join me in thanking Ramesh, Dr. Raghavan, for a wonderful talk. Dr. Moon's going to tell you about